event. I think I have to say, got it. Perfect. I want to welcome everybody to DC Lera's presentation by Harold Myerson today, October 13th. I'm Steve Sleigh, the president of DC Lera. We are a chapter of the Labor and Employment Relations Association, which is headquartered at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. We have two of the crackerjack staff people who run the organization, Emily Smith and Bernadette Tiemann, and behind the scenes running the show. So thank you guys. We also want to thank our colleagues at the U.S.-Canada Office of the International Labor Organization. They are the co-sponsors of these webinars. We're doing a special series on return to work and sort of the state of the economy circa 2021. We've got a great presentation coming up today, and then another one on Friday. So pack your schedule with DC Lera events. We got Dan Pedrati, who will be with our own Steve Sylvia on Friday, talking about the White House Task Force on Worker Representation and Empowerment. Should be a great conversation. Last week, we had the head of the Federal Reserve Board Bank of Richmond, Tom Barkin, talking in sort of a broad sense about the economy, looking at the macro point of view and how policymakers are looking at the economy. And then in the
Steve?
We can't hear you, Steve. You've suddenly cut out.
Yep, somehow it just muted me, and there I'm back. So we had Tom Barkin last week talking about a macro case of the economy, and then we're going to have Chantel Sheeks and Mark Friedman from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce talking about the business view of the economy. So 4 great presentations, and without much further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Harold Myerson to talk about the role of organized labor and sort of the state of the labor market. Harold is a prolific and incredible journalist and author, writes for the American Prospect, is one of the most knowledgeable people about a whole bunch of issues, including the labor movement and reporting on what's going on in workplaces. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Harold. And what we're going to do is, the way we do these conversations is that Harold will talk 10, 15 minutes. I'll ask the first question, but folks, everyone else is muted right now. But if you have a question when he's done, we really want this to be interactive and have people ask questions. So please don't be bashful. You can either put it in the chat, your question, put your hand up, or just when we get to it, you can just sort of blurt out your question. So with that, Harold, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. I have, in years past, spoken to DC Lera on a number of occasions and always had quite a good time. I miss walking down to the, whatever it's called, the Women's National Democratic Club, which is like a 10-minute walk from my house, where these things have usually been held. But now we have even eliminated the 10-minute walk. I'm home, and we'll go from here. So a few minutes before I signed on here, I noted that the stagehands and everyone behind the scenes union in Hollywood, IATSE, which voted 99% of the 90% of their 60,000 members employed by the studios to authorize a strike, has now set a strike deadline of Monday. And what we are beginning to see is sort of a qualified strike wave, which is notable chiefly because for the last 40 years, we haven't had a strike wave. The number of strikes was already declining from the late 1960s on, but after Reagan busted the Air Traffic Controllers Union who had gone on strike in 1981, major corporations began actually provoking strikes because they felt they could either get the union to accept far worse pay and working conditions than they had expected, or just let the members go and hire replacements. And the number of strikes declined precipitously. All of a sudden, we are seeing all kinds of strikes among stagehands, among bakery and confection workers, the largely unheralded Bakery, Confection, Tobacco, and Grain Millers Union is now embarked on the third of getting ever larger strikes in its industry just in the last couple months, really. And we're seeing this kind of militance in other sectors as well. Now, I want to turn to what is the lead story in today's Washington Post, which is the quit rate of American workers leaving their jobs. And turns out that in August, a record number of American workers told their bosses to take the job and shove it, that they were leaving. Over 4 million workers, 3% of the workforce. And since the Post very nicely looked at this by sector, we know that this is particularly prevalent with a 7% quit rate in just 1 month in hospitality, in restaurants and hotels. And the second highest quit rate of nearly 5% was in retail. The technical economic term for this kind of employment is shit jobs. And America really is notable among the OECD nations, particularly in comparison to Western Europe, for having a higher percentage of low-paying, no-benefit jobs than other nations do. I want to argue that at a time when the private sector unionization rate is below 7%, that what we are seeing in the quit rate is the non-union equivalent of a strike wave, that workers are doing what workers in unions do when they go on strike. I'm withdrawing my labor until I can find something with better working conditions, better pay, maybe some benefits. And this is what a non-union strike wave, in essence, looks like. The great social scientist Albert Hirschman used to argue that within institutions, essentially the options for people in those institutions who wanted to change things was either voice, you get together, you make a demand, or exit, I'm out of here. Well, as everyone on this call knows, most American employers have successfully denied their workers the option of voice. The opposition to unionization has been constant across pretty much all sectors. Only when workers are essentially irreplaceable, as they are in some of the media and tech institutions that have gone union, that have gone union in recent years, it's still basically normal for employers to oppose and usually defeat efforts to unionize, but they're getting the Hirschman, response of exit, having denied their workers the option of voice. Now, if we are indeed having this kind of semi-demi strike wave, and we have certainly not seen the end of it, nor the end of quit rates being higher than perhaps ever before. Excuse me. If we're seeing that, I think we need to look at the two previous instances of record numbers of strikes and what this year may have in common with them. Those 2 years when strikes peaked in the American economic history were 1919 and 1946. That is the years after the two world wars. And at the time, large numbers of American, in those cases, men returning from the hell of service on front lines, came back to a nation that hailed them as heroes, but went into the existing labor market, often reclaiming their old jobs, where the opportunities were not great. And their response was a record number of strikes in 1919, including a massive strike in what was then the nation's largest industries in terms of employment, that is steelmaking. Long militant strikes there. The Boston police went out on strike, which was busted by then the Boston mayor, a guy named Calvin Coolidge. And largely those strikes did not really succeed in winning things for workers because there was no real state support at that point for collective bargaining. The 1946 strike wave did follow hard on the New Deal and a record level of union membership, at that point about a third, or if not even a little higher than a third among private sector workers. And a lot was indeed won in 1946. Well, now we have a different definition of working on the front lines. It's not participating in the world wars. It's being out there in jobs that required showing up for work at a time of pandemic. And I would argue that this kind of frontline obligation has engendered a somewhat similar response to the frontline returnees following the world wars, that these people have often been hailed as heroes, but they're also in some of the most low-paying, no benefit, and often unable to control one's work hours industries. So we're seeing, I think, a kind of post, which really isn't quite post yet, unfortunately, post-pandemic response similar to the post-World War response. Three events that massively upended American lives, to which workers respond saying, we don't want to go back to what there was before. For unions, this is an interesting moment as such. They have the friendliest administration in power, I would argue, than at any time in American history. They're not going to be able to get the PRO Act through Congress. And their ability to organize, despite everything that's going on, despite record levels of support for unions coming out in things like the Gallup poll and the Pew poll, close to about 2/3 of Americans have favorable assessments of unions. Among young people, it's more than 3/4. You know, all of this going on the one hand. On the other hand, you still have the almost pathological opposition of employers to letting their workers have a voice. And you have a labor law which is so dysfunctional that it lets employers get away with that, even though what they're doing violates a lot of the terms of the National Labor Relations Act. You have a labor department, which is going, when it gets fully staffed, if ever, I think, to be very good on the question of addressing misclassification of workers. You have an NLRB with a very creative, brilliant general counsel, Jennifer Abruzzo, who is talking about going back to a standard that enabled workers basically to reclaim the power they once had if their employers do violate the terms of the National Labor Relations Act. So it's very much a mixed picture. And with that, since I'm about hitting my limit on presentation, I'm happy to go back to Steve and set up a discussion. So
perfect.
Steve,
thank you, Harold. That was a really good overview. And for those who don't subscribe to the American Prospect, we'll try to get some of the articles that you've written posted to the website.
And by the way, it's www.prospect.org.
Yep. And I think you can just sign up and put your email in and get access to it. So it's
we're free.
There's not a paywall there.
We're free and we need your money.
Yeah, well, I really, the whole question of the media and the concentration of the media is another whole thing. But so Harold, talk to us a little bit about, we read about the Great Resignation, and I know in my own work, finding qualified folks for specific jobs has become much more difficult than it was 2 years ago. Talk a little bit about the role of organized labor as an entity. I mean, you're absolutely right that the Biden administration is probably the most pro-union administration ever. Where do you see the labor movement itself going? And I'm also just reflecting on a couple of years ago, we had a presentation by somebody from the teachers union who was talking about the wave of militancy that was happening within teachers, and it was mostly non-union. And so sort of talk about how organized labor is working with these other sort of unaffiliated groups, and what's sort of the mood within organized labor itself.
Well, I think there is, at a certain level, a kind of frustration, because certainly the leaders and the staffs of American unions are aware that unions are more popular than they have ever been. I think when they look at this quit rate, they see what I just described, that there is militants out there. But the frustration is they don't quite know how to take advantage of this. Striking is certainly a growing option, as we can see, for workers already in unions. Unions that had not contemplated a strike in decades are now thinking about it. But the issue of expansion is continually, the hill that they have to climb, and they're still in the Sisyphus condition of rolling back down the hill because the labor law just isn't working. And I know some unionists who have placed a good deal of hope in some of the changing regulations of that might come down from the NLRB. But I think there's largely this sense of frustration, particularly since, excuse me, it's clear that where workers really can't easily be replaced, those workers can unionize. You're seeing media institutions that have been anti-union forever going union, LA Times, Chicago Trib. You're seeing new media outlets, digital outlets going union. The college campuses certainly are, a fount of worker militants. But again, how to connect to that is the Rubik's Cube that unions have yet to figure out how to assemble, or whatever you do, it is with a Rubik's Cube. Where the new AFL-CIO leadership is going to go is, on one hand, not particularly clear. On the other hand, Liz Schuler is certainly one of the most affable people in American labor, and I think it's pretty clear that she will be confirmed in her new position by the AFL-CIO convention next year, and that she'll do a lot of work with affiliates. I think it is now a decent chance that the Teamsters under new leadership will re-affiliate with the AFL-CIO under new, to wit, Liz's leadership. And the Teamster campaign at Amazon augurs to be a big deal, though it's not yet clear entirely how that's going to work. And I think the Teamsters themselves will say it's not yet clear entirely. They do have a sort of a game plan, but how much of that game plan is going to work remains unclear.
So I'm going to ask one more two-part question here, and then we're seeing some questions pop up in the chat room, and I'll turn it over to those folks in a second. But interesting that you raised Amazon. Of course, earlier this year, there was a very high-profile organizing attempt at Amazon, not by the Teamsters, by RWDSU, which is part of the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, which resulted in a catastrophic defeat for labor, not even close. But so sort of reflect on that a little bit. I mean, if unions are so popular, why are they not winning elections? And second of all,
if your speaker is not working, please check your connection or use a different speaker. But I have two speakers.
There we go. So Harold, the first part of the question was about the Amazon election earlier this year, and the second thing is within this wave of militancy that you're seeing now, is there a common theme of issues? So those are the two, and then Mindy Reeser has a question in the chat room, and we'll get to her in 1 second.
Sure. Well, Amazon and at Bessemer in the warehouse there was the kind of example of what has been normal attempts to form unions for the last many decades, which is to say the unequal power of the employer can dwarf whatever worker sentiment there may be. Now, you could argue, and I think reasonably, that if you're going to try to break through an employer like Amazon, you don't do it in a place where what Amazon is paying actually exceeds much of the pay that the jobs offer in that vicinity, that community support in and of itself usually, under these conditions is not enough. I mean, they had rallied clergy and civil rights groups and such. But again, it just confirms that when workers are fearful of losing their jobs, and when de facto, if not de jure, the employer says, you get out on the limb for the union and you're gone, buddy, that is still the hill that unions cannot take. And I know what the Teamsters are planning on doing is looking for whatever softer terrain there is. It's looking at support for antitrust campaigns against Amazon. Sometimes unions win because of issues that may not be directly related to the work site. The way the hotel workers got very big in Las Vegas involved actually a deal with the hotel union to help them lobby for some tax issues in Washington. So, nonetheless, Amazon is both daunting and emblematic of what happens in most attempts to unionize, where the workforce doesn't feel it's relatively invulnerable because they're hard to replace. And the second part of your question about the common thread, I think it's the same kind of mentality that we saw at the end of that we read about. We don't necessarily are old enough to have seen it in the years following the two world wars, that workers don't want to go back to jobs that don't offer much, plus which in this particular instance, there's actually some danger of contracting a potentially deadly disease and being in the workplace. And I think that's certainly, there's kind of a double whammy in looking at the quit rates in hotel and restaurant and retail. Those are frontline jobs where you come into contact with all kinds of people, and there is a risk entailed in that. And so, that it's a combination of that and the fact that these aren't great jobs to begin with, to put it mildly. So there we are.
Okay. Mindy Reeser, why don't, Emily, if you could unmute Mindy and she can ask her question, and then I've got Steve Sylvia right after that. So Mindy?
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
All
I can
right,
hear you, Mindy.
Harold, an absolutely fascinating presentation. You've highlighted some really interesting issues. And I'd like to ask you to address another one. We know that increasingly America is becoming a multi-ethnic society, and the rate of population increase of our friends and neighbors who are brown and Black is increasing. I'd like to know how that is reflected in the union leadership, in union membership, in highlighting some issues of racism and discrimination that Black and brown union members are facing, and where you see this increasing wave of a demographic group influencing the union movement.
Well, as we all know, unions have a mixed history on this issue, ranging from a kind of single-minded emphasis on class among a relatively small number of unionists to, that racism exists in unions as it exists in every other American institution. It's funny, at the leadership level of some unions, there have already been, major shifts of gender leadership and such. I think of the 6 unions that have 1 million or more members, at least 2, let me think about this, at least 2 have presidents who are African American, and at least 3 have presidents who are women, 2 of them out of the closet lesbians. So, that's a mix. Historically, African Americans have had a higher level of support for unions than white Americans. I don't really know the data on Hispanics, although I can say that when there have been initiatives in California to weaken the power of unions, the exit polls have shown a great deal of Hispanic support for unions, even higher, not just higher than the level of support among whites, but even higher than the level of support among Blacks. I think there is a steady concern for economic advancement and economic issues within a very large mixed category of Latino the Latino share of the United States, and that has been reflected. And the ballot measures I'm referring to are maybe 20 years old, but they were a pretty clear indication then, and I don't know that that's diminished now. I mean, to the extent, what we're seeing, even amid clearly a growing tendency among white blue-collar workers to go to, in some cases, the extremes, in some cases not the extremes of the Trumpian right. I don't think this necessarily also often encompasses things like opposition to unions, which gets to the whole vexing question that Ezra Klein dealt with recently of Democrats emphasizing economic issues and if not downplaying, at least not emphasizing as much the kind of issues that are more social, cultural, racial, gender oriented, etc. Clearly, this was the approach of the Biden administration in pushing its 2 major pieces of legislation that are currently stuck on Capitol Hill. But anyway, so it's a mixed bag. Of course, Liz Schuler is the first woman to head the AFL-CIO, and we'll see where all of that goes. At the same time, the unions that are most how to put this, dragging their feet on issues of race and gender, tend to be unions dominated by a more aggressive, well, all the police unions, let's put it that way. And I will leave that there, though if you have a follow-up, I'll take it.
Fantastic.
Great,
Yeah.
great.
And actually, that's a good segue to the next question, which is from Steve Silvio, who's going to be moderating our conversation with Dan Pedrati on Friday. So, Steve, you probably will be asking Dan this question as well. But Steve, why don't you fire away?
Sure, thanks, Steve. So, the question I have, basically the one that I wrote in the chat, that why does the AFL-CIO continue to push the PRO Act, even though it's been pretty clear since January that it isn't going to get through the Senate? I also just follow David Jacobs, has an interesting thing that he wrote in the chat as well about things in the Build Back Better legislation. He mentioned one, penalty on labor law being increased. There's another one which is having union-made electric cars getting not $5,000 tax break, but $10,000. And are there any other Easter eggs that you can think of that are in the Build Back Better Act for unions in their chances of making it?
Well, the original hope was that the PRO Act could be part of the reconciliation bill of Build Back Better. That's clearly not going to be the case, although there has been discussion about at least increasing the level of fines that employers are required to pay if they violate the terms of the NLRA in the PRO Act. I honestly have lost track as to whether that's still there or not, but I think all of us have lost track of what's in and what's out of the of the Build Back Better bill. I think there are several interconnected ways in which both the bill and administration policy is trying to do what the extra incentive for buying an electric car if it's union made does. Certainly the whole push, which is, the first time in, I can't say how long, very long, the whole push for domestic content is not directly related to boosting unions, but certainly indirectly related, and deals with the the fact that unions were right for a very long time and on the losing end, even within the Democratic Party for a very long time, on the issues of trade and on the issues that I see someone on this call, John Russo, has dealt with the consequences of extensively. And there's just even a new survey out now demonstrating how, communities where factories were closed have been zooming rightward for some time. So the emphasis on trade and on bringing jobs back to America or starting new jobs in America is certainly a major focus, not just of some parts of the Building Back Better bill, but of the Biden administration. And we see in the Labor Department doing unprecedented things like intervening under the new version of NAFTA on behalf of Mexican workers, in the very appointments that the administration has made to deal with such issues, putting Thea Lee, who for years was the chief trade economist for the AFL-CIO, in charge of the international labor part of the Labor Department, and Catherine Tai as the U.S. trade rep. All of those are part of the many ways in which the Biden presidency is trying to bolster both the domestic work opportunities and as an adjunct to that, better conditions bolstering union labor. But again, still the fundamental question is, can labor law be changed? I can understand why the PRO Act remains a talking point, but how much Whether they can even get the increased fines into Building Back Better remains to be seen.
Great, thanks, thanks, Harold. And Dave Jacobs, I think you had a question that was partially answered there, but David, why don't you jump in here?
Oh, I think that Harold said that we're not actually sure what's in the Build Back Better Act. So I hope that there's some increased prospect of wrapping some labor law improvements in the Build Back Better Act. Of course, I'm hopeful about all sorts of dimensions of this. Don't want to be disillusioned, so please don't do that at the moment.
And some of that relates to what the Senate parliamentarian will view as germane. The point about employee fines could possibly pass under reconciliation, and that's because it might pass muster with the Senate parliamentarian, and I think that's why it's been highlighted as perhaps the one surviving element of the PRO Act in Build Back Better. So there is, in addition to the Manchin and Sinema and Gottheimer and other hurdles, there is the parliamentarian hurdle as well.
Absolutely. Right. And the filibuster hurdle, but
oh God, yes. Well,
what we, in one trajectory, which we would hope would happen, at least from some people's perspective, is that the difficulty of moving on raising the debt ceiling will increase some of the resistance to, will it provide an opportunity to move to the filibuster, which then sets a precedent. So there may be a path forward if anybody follows it.
From your lips.
Very good. So Harold, take a couple of minutes and just tell us a little bit more about the IATSE strike or pending strike. You know, these are quite literally the behind the scenes people, and so they are not the famous folks on stage or in films. Talk a little bit about what the issues are. How are the actors and the folks in front of the camera? How are they being supportive? And just give us a little flavor of what this particular struggle is all about.
Well, to begin, just as a general point, IATSE has power because it impacts right at the point of production. If you're shooting a movie, if you're making a TV show, if you're making something to be streamed, and everyone behind the camera walks away, that shuts down production. So that's a lot of power. And just as a side note to begin, all of the stagehands at the Kennedy Center here in Washington, their union was threatening a strike to begin, I think today.
Yeah.
Because a major musical, I forget which, is supposed to open at the Kennedy Center tonight, and they settled, management settled yesterday facing that disaster. And I think that the IATSE membership in LA, largely in LA, feels it has a kindred power, and I think they're right. Now, they haven't struck, there hasn't been a strike like this since, right after World War II. Late 1945, it wasn't IATSE. IATSE at that point was a union controlled by the Chicago Mafia, and it cut sweetheart deals. But there was a conference of studio unions that included all kinds of folks who were behind the camera, but not in IATSE. They struck, and this kind of reflects the the sort of the left strain and the, in this case, not just more conservative, but mobbed up strain of American labor around the mid 1940s. The studios really employed thugs to, there was one famous day outside Warner Brothers where all kinds of people ended up in the hospital because of the thugs that, in this case, Warner Brothers, which historically was the only studio run by executives who at that point aligned themselves with the Democratic Party, nonetheless sent a lot of strikers to the hospital. IATSE has slowly, it got unmobbed by the late 1940s and has become more of what we would consider a normal union over the years and more politicized. I know when I spent the 1990s and the early aughts, editing the LA Weekly, which is then a paper kind of like the Village Voice at its best, if I can make that claim. And IATSE was beginning to do things at that point, like having its members walk precincts for progressive causes and candidates. It's been moving sort of steadily in a direction that progressive unionists would consider increasingly one of their own. And this time around, it has support from all of the other, in front, not behind of the camera unions, the Screen Actors Guild, the directors, the writers, and of course, I mean, these are the people who make their work possible. Part of the, there's several issues here as to why now. One of them is that from the 1960s through the 1980s, all labor disputes in Hollywood came before really one studio executive who all the studios let handle this, and that was Lew Wasserman at Universal, who was old enough to have remembered the behind-the-scenes crooked dealings with IATSE, who was nonetheless sort of, in theory, okay with unions. He was leading the Hollywood campaign contribution collector for Democratic presidents, ranging from Lyndon Johnson up to Bill Clinton over those decades. And he was a very skilled negotiator. He had headed Hollywood's largest talent agency. And so Wasserman settled everything for many decades in Hollywood. There is no Wasserman now. And more to the point, you have all kinds of new folks with more money to burn than they know what to do with. So they get into producing a product like Apple, like Amazon. Jeff Bezos now is at the top of an organization that makes movies. And these guys are kind of libertarians. And so that poses a new challenge for the unions. And you have the whole issue, which has vexed the other Hollywood unions over the years, of streaming and the huge increase in the number of productions as a result of that. I mean, the old studios used to turn out, there were 8 of them, they used to turn out a picture a week in the 1930s and 40s. Now there are more than 500 things that go up on TV or are streamed every year, and this has played all kinds of havoc with work hours and the stability of employment. I mean, a lot of these things, there are now more what used to be called mini series. So instead of a steady job on a 39-week schedule for a TV series in days of yore, there are only 10 episodes made or 6 episodes made. So work has become sort of descheduled in Hollywood. How much you get paid when working on a streaming production is an issue. That was behind the writer's strike of 2007, since they knew what they were going to get paid when their movie got aired on TV, but there was no standard for what happened. I remember I wrote a Washington Post column at the time about this, saying, I had to explain streaming at that point, since it was a new thing. And I just noted that I didn't think Lawrence of Arabia would look very, very good on my cell phone, even if my mother didn't call during the attack on Aqaba. And then Jon Stewart actually lifted that joke for the Oscars that year. But anyway, and I got nothing for it. So all of these things have made the lives of the folks who work behind the cameras and design the sets and apply the makeup and build this and build that, and all of this has made their lives much more complicated, and sometimes working longer for less. So they are now threatening to go out on next Monday, and we'll see what happens.
I'm told that the musical is called Hadestown.
That's right. Yes, Hadestown. That's what is opening at the Kennedy Center tonight.
Right.
So
exactly. With IATSE on the behind the stage. So
That's right.
good.
That's right. That they were not, the management was not willing to throw their opening night away.
Yep. If you have a question, this is a good time to jump in. I have another one, so if no one jumps right in. Oh, wait a second, there we got Patrick McHugh. Patrick, why don't you throw in your question there?
Hi, everyone. Harold, this great presentation. I'm going to have my students watch this recording. This is great stuff. Just a question, for many years now, this idea of people working at organizations for an extended period of time, loyalty between employer and employees is really out the window, right? And we've got much more of a transitory employment situation. Precarious for many. Does that make quitting more relevant and this non-union wave, and making union organizing even more difficult since people don't feel linked to voice and staying in organizations?
I think the answer to all of that is yes. Historically, the industries that have been most unionized have tended to be those where the workforce was relatively stable and relatively permanent. So as employers have really kind of moved away from that model, I think that in itself has been an obstacle for unions. I know, God, I've been writing about unions for more than 30 years. And 35 years. And it was already the case even early on that, I was noting at that point that workers were more likely to be involved in union activities and to identify when the job was really kind of stable, like an old auto industry job. And I contrasted that at the time with the turnover in supermarkets, where the penetration, although the United Food and Commercial Workers is a large union, where the penetration and then the level of member participation in unions has never been as high as in some other sectors, partly because a lot of that workforce, even then, was moving in and out. And that's only been exacerbated, as you note, Patrick, in recent decades by the shift to transitory employment. Now, that said, on the one hand, that argues as a programmatic point for a greater emphasis on government provided benefits and setting of wage levels, since that goes across, that can deal at some level with the casualization of work. But in general, yes, I think it does make it harder for unions. And, you might almost have to go to the kind of structure that the Knights of Labor had, where union membership was not directly tied to employment to get around that, although that obviously has its downsides as well.
Yeah, that's great. Anybody else with a question, jump in there. If I don't see one, I'm going to ask you, Harold, to go a little bit deeper on an issue that you talked about briefly, which is the whole question of independent contractors. The irony, of course, is, an irony is that the term gig economy came out of the music scene and in some ways the art scene, where people never had stable jobs. They moved from place to place. They had gigs. And so could you just sort of talk about that a little bit? I mean, this pandemic response for the first time recognized gig economy, independent contractors as a group of folks who should get benefits along with everybody else on unemployment. What do you sort of see as how is that going to evolve, and how is organized labor's response to independent contractors going to evolve? Where do you sort of see the terrain heading?
Well, labor's been all over the map. Unions have been all over the map on what to do with independent contractors. The whole issue of drivers in New York City, the machinists had one position, the taxi union had another position. Do you cut a halfway house? Do you set up an independent sub full-time employee standard? The position of organized labor confronting this has been a little spread out all over the map. One of the things the Biden Labor Department, once it gets fully up and running, appears to be dedicated to doing is putting in a standard that basically says, if you walk like a duck, you're a duck. And certainly the Deputy Secretary of Labor, Julie Su, who previously had been the labor commissioner in California under Jerry Brown and then Gavin Newsom, was known for fining employers who misclassified workers as independent contractors when they were really just doing the work of the company. At some point, David Weil will be confirmed, let us assume, by the Senate, who will go to the Wage and Hours Division, where he was in the second term of Barack Obama's presidency, who really, David is the author of the book, The Fissured Workplace, about the split between workers and their actual employers, and he was beginning the crackdown on misclassification. I note that a federal court in California, I think over the weekend or on Monday, levied the largest fine against an operation that actually employs the port truckers at the Port of Los Angeles, which has been a site of trying to organize workers who are continually labeled independent contractors. Anyway, the largest fine ever was levied against a company at the Port of LA just at the beginning of this week. I think you're going to see a pushback against misclassification of workers, which is a form actually of wage theft. And you know, I think the dissatisfaction among the so-called gig workers, you know, hailed as heroes, you know, working without benefits, working to have to pick up their own expenses, but working for just the same company, one company. That's part of the larger issue of worker discontent, of worker churn that we're seeing now. Even the quit rates don't really reflect what's going on among independent contractors, but I think it's safe to assume that they are among the millions of American workers who are looking for something better. And all we can say at this stage of employee relations and the post and not quite post-pandemic economy is let's hope that they can find something better. Let's hope that they can get the kind of job that actually clearly is listed as employee, and that things will change enough so that unionizing becomes, you know, a more plausible option for workers, not just, you know, professors and high-tech workers, but all workers.
Fantastic. I think that's a pretty good place to come to a conclusion here. We're just about done with our hour. Really appreciate it. I really encourage everyone to dial in on Friday at noon. We're going to have a conversation with Dan Pedrati, who came out of the Building Trades Union and served on the White House Task Force on Worker Representation and Empowerment. A lot of these issues will be talked about. The commission's report is due out by the end of the month. I think Dan will give us a preview of what's going to be in there. Our own Steve Sylvia will be moderating that conversation, so we'll look forward to that. But Harold, just fantastic to have you, and just tell us the last words. What's the next article?
The next article, well, you know, I've written about, just in passing, in the terms of writing about the return of the strike, about a union that I've never written about in my 35 years of writing about unions. That's the bakery, confectionery, BCTGM workers. And since all of a sudden they're on a roll, I thought I would, they're up Connecticut Avenue from me. I thought I'd drop in on them if anyone's in the office in this peculiar period and do some work about them. So if bakers will lead us, I will gladly chart the course.
That's fantastic. Well, let's see if we can't get our daily bread through that story.
Good.
Thanks so much, Harold, for joining us. Thank you all for the participants. Emily, Bernadette, thank you for the hosting from Illinois. Thank you to the U.S.-Canada Office of the ILO, Kevin Cassidy and Andrea Cubas Sanchez for co-hosting this with us. And we will see all of you on Friday at noon, I hope. And thanks again, Harold.
Thank you.